Good morning, everyone. Welcome to GSWF 2020. I'd ask that presenting or speaking. Please do close any unnecessary programs if you're experiencing slow bandwidth. Feel free to also use the public chat box to engage with one another. This session is being live streamed, and the recording will remain public on the ERA Asia Pacific YouTube channel. ERA Asia Pacific is committed to making GSWF 2020 an inclusive and safe digital environment, and we will not tolerate harassment of any kind, including but not limited to deliberate intimidation and sustained disruption of discussion. Participants are obliged to be respectful and to avoid replicating societal prejudices and inequalities. Participants who engage in disruptive behavior may be removed without prior notice. Now, I'll pass this session over to Amelia.
Hello, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here again with you. And thank you again to the organizers of the Global South Women's Forum 2020. It's been an amazing week with the gathering of so many feminists discussing all of these issues regarding macroeconomics and the real challenges that people are suffering on the ground. So thank you as well to the Third World Network, which is organizing this amazing panel with a very not only current discussion, but really what it's to me a mystery, which is indeed why is it that in the middle of the pandemics, with all of the evidence that we have so far about the horrible impacts of austerity, why is it that the international financial institutions are still insisting on imposing those into developing countries? So this is a matter of fiscal justice. It is an urgent matter as well. And is, as we will see today as well, it is not only perpetuating a colonial dynamic over the countries of the Global South, but it is also coming from a specific ideology that has been harming human rights, the environmental integrity, gender equality, and many other issues across the globe. So this is a very much needed conversation, and indeed, I think that the questions that are posed for this panel are not superficial. I think it is not only necessary to understand what are the true impacts of austerity in the population, but also what is behind the imposition of austerity in our countries. So we have an amazing lineup of speakers, and without further ado, I'm just gonna say, I'm gonna start the session. I'm also going to introduce myself. I'm Emilia Reyes. I'm working in a feminist Mexican organization, which is called Gender Equity, Citizenship, Work and Family. And we're also co-conveners of the Women's Working Group on FFD. And I'll be very happy to be the moderator of this conversation. So I'm gonna start by giving the floor to Andrea Guillem. She's coming from the Centro de Derechos Económicos y Sociales, and she will speak about the impacts of the IMF loan packages to Ecuador, and specifically what are the impacts on gender equality, on the poor and the marginalized, and how all of these proposals are actually impacting at the core of all of the efforts that the country is having to face the pandemics. So Andrea Guillem, she's an Ecuadorian progressive feminist who advocates for tax justice. She's a researcher in gender and economic rights for the Center of Economics and Social Rights in Ecuador. And she's also the coordinator of gender projects for economic autonomy, I'm sorry. So Andrea, go ahead. You have the floor.
Thanks, Emilia. I'm really glad to be sharing this event. Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. It depends where you're watching. I am very grateful for the invitation. Thank you to Bhumika, to Emilia, to Kate for the invitation, and I'm very excited to hear the fellow panelists. women that I admire and respect a lot, and which whose works I've been following. And how Emilia said, I want to talk about the austerity consequences that we're facing in Ecuador. We saw last year a protest that shocked the world because of its violent and its one line that said we are against the IMF. And I want to talk about the moment that we are facing in Ecuador with the multilateral, and reveal the contradictory narrative that IMF is having in our region. And well, the IMF history with Latin America, and especially Ecuador, has a history of conflict. We have a relationship with IMF since 1969, but we have 10 years, a period of 10 years that we didn't get along until 2016, that we asked for their approval to put sovereign bonds on the international financial market. But it is until 2019 that we reach an agreement of $40,000 million. And but a previous to that, to get to the agreement, we have to give a sign of austerity, and there was preconditions, and that includes a huge tax cuts for the larger groups that it's calculated around $1,000 million. It's more. That's legally what they have cut, and what public registration shows, and a labor reform that incentivizes precarious jobs, and also cuts in the budgets of health, education, and the programs that are directly to to prevent and eradicate gender violence and teenage pregnancy. But in 2019, when we reached to the agreement, the government, to follow the recipe that the conditions and the recommendations that they give us in their staff report, passed two legislations and cut the subsidy of gas. So I want to focus in each one of them, and talk about the consequences of these measures, of these economic measures, and especially focus on women and vulnerable groups. So the cuts in the subsidy, that was the spark, what sparked the flame in the discontent of the people, because when you get rid of a subsidy such as gas, there's an inflation shock that especially hits the poorest families and the most vulnerable groups of the society. But also, when you make a study about how these inflation shocks impact on women, the Center of Economic Rights had made scenarios of these inflation shocks, and with the best scenario of inflation, that is 3%, that will mean that 68,000 women will pass to poverty line, and just talking about women with no incomes, and women with incomes, those who work, would have passed to the poverty line about 32,000 women. The other measure that was taken that affects mainly the jobs, what made is that a form of contract that were especially made for women. And that is very dangerous, because there is a belief that women is the one that deserve precarious jobs in working for hours. And that was everything that sparked the strike that we see last year. And several international organizations of human rights has assessed the event and has made a declaration. There has have made declarations that the government did not evaluate these measures and did not consult to the people these measures. And in 2020, this year, in the middle of our worst sanitary crisis, and that we see bodies on the streets of Guayaquil, the government prepaid debt that could pay a year later, but they prepaid debt in order to get another agreement with the IMF. And that was very irresponsible, because in the time where we needed the most these resources to save lives and save jobs, the government prepaid to these international creditors. And in May of this year, the IMF is starting to get a new agreement with Ecuador, and they are signed in October. So this new agreement is what we see that is contradictory, because in the middle of calls around the world, worldwide, about the cancellation of illegitimate debt, and we see calls worldwide of the restructuring the financial system, we see that these multilateral organizations has changed the narrative and the discourse. So in the one of the main objectives of this new agreement that we have signed in October, that is around $2,000 million, it's to protect lives and livelihoods. But when we see the staff report and we read what are the recommendations to do so, it is unrealizable. And I want to talk about the reforms that IMF is asking, and a reflection of the consequences of these reforms that has not been taking place, but in the months to come, they are going to pass these reforms. One of them is the reduction of salary of mass of the salary. That means more layoffs in the public sector, and that means to for their recommendations is that we should reduce the basic salary, but the Constitution do not let us do that. So what they have done is freeze the basic salary in a time when the people need most liquidity, because they are facing debt, they are facing funeral spending of the health, um, um, spending of health, because we have already passed a sanitary crisis. When people need most liquidity, what happens is they freeze the salary, and the actual consumption that salary gives you is reducing. Another thing that they are asking is to increase VAT in 3 points. So there is no tax for rich, there is no fiscal justice in this. They are telling us that the best way to collecting taxes it's through the VAT, and that 3% increase of VAT will be extremely dangerous and for most vulnerable groups.
Andrea, you have 2 minutes.
Oh, thank you. So This VAT increase will be more dangerous on women that already pay the pink tax and that already are struggling. And another thing that they are asking is, and this is really dangerous because they're trying to institutionalize the austerity. That means that whatever government came in the next year, there is a frame, an institutional frame that institutionalizes austerity by putting the central bank in the hands of private sector. That will mean very low capacity um, of the next government to give liquidity through the instruments that give you central bank to the people. And that's why we think that the rhetoric of the IMF is contradictory. So they have this face, this public face, that they care for the life and livelihoods. But what they are asking is not consequent with what they are telling to the world. And we know that resource to public debt as the only way to obtain income is due to the lack of courage to reformulate the tax system and get the money where it really is. And just to give you some data, in Ecuador, the top 1 and the top 10% last year only paid 3% of their incomes in taxes. 2% less than the year before, 2018. Meanwhile, the burden of the debt is taken on the backs of working people, especially women, that are seeking the ways of sustaining lives in their homes and in their capacity. So that is what I can tell you about what is happening now in Ecuador, and it's really important to shine a light on what is happening in the country, because in the next days there is a new review of the IMF, and we have to try to make pressure to this multilateral to really to really do what they are saying, that it's putting lives first. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Andrea. And you are bringing a lot of issues on the table. First of all, the responsibility both of the state and of IMF, as our dear Priyanti Fernando is pointing out very accurately. There is a responsibility on those decisions, but also you're pointing out a different layer, which is the relation between debt and fiscal solutions, and the reluctance on applying those. And you're also making a link between the need of a global system to address the national situation. And we will definitely want to continue to hear you more on this issue, but I'm gonna give the floor to our next speaker, who's gonna continue on addressing the impacts of these type of policies, but now in a different region. We will hear what is the impact of the IMF's loan packages in Egypt and Tunisia. And we're gonna be hearing from Mahinur El Badrawi, who's a program officer at the Center for Economic and Social Rights. And her work focuses on Skillshare and cross-movement learning and exchange across the fields of human rights, development, and economic justice. And she's also in the center's MENA focal point. Welcome, Mahinur. You have the floor.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me, and thank you for all the organizers, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to share a few thoughts on very similar patterns that are happening in North Africa. So I will focus mainly in my remarks on Egypt, but also draw parallels with Tunisia. Very important topic. So just briefly. In history, this topic brings us back to 2011, to the Arab Springs, when people across the Arab region have revolted, demanding for bread, liberty, and social justice. And the IFIs and the world classic economic governance we're looking at those countries and saying, oh, well, you've made it very well out of the economic crisis. Egypt was being used as a model, for example, saying that, look, you have 7% GDP growth. There's nothing to worry about. Yet the crisis happened because we were looking at indicators that only look at an economy that does not work for the people or the planet. So we have the G7 and in a Deauville partnership, for those who remember that moment, come in and say, look, if you sign this agreement, we will support you and support your democratic political transition if you stay within the same old neoliberal economic system. So that has paved the way for a series of regressive loan agreements across the region, pretty much a cookie cutter for Egypt that meant to reduce public spending, reform the civil service laws to reduce the public wage bill, decrease the role of the public sector in service provision and in providing universal subsidies, and to also raise state revenue through regressive resource mobilization models. So introducing VAT for the first time, liberalizing the exchange rates, for the currency to fluctuate with market forces, to be more appealable to foreign investment and for private sector. So that was faced by a massive wave of resistance that was crushed, unfortunately, in 2013 and 2014 as a military dictatorship took over, which fun fact, the president of Egypt just received the highest honor medal from President Macron a couple days ago. Very, very ironic. So that moment we see really the democratic governance system where resource mobilization, allocation, and spending should have been transparent, participatory, and accountable, no longer attainable, unfortunately. So with that, we see the government being prepared to take a loan agreement 3 years after the negotiations started, when the army consolidated power. I'm not sure if you can see my screen. Maybe I can increase it a little bit. So this is a little graph that shows the increase in poverty since those reforms have been implemented, together with the decrease of Egypt's standing on civil and political freedoms. So if we also look at this little visuals, it shows us how implementing the IMF policy in increasing electricity tariffs, removing fuel subsidies, and introducing VATs throughout the years of 2011 to 2018 has raised poverty rates from 25% to 32.5%. And Egypt is 100 million people, so that means 32.5 million people living under the national poverty line. Yet, however, the IMF and IFIs and the Egyptian government still presented Egypt as a success story. It keeps on saying, oh, Egypt has turned a corner. Egypt is a global South leader. It's a success story. And because of lack of participatory democracy, voices of opposition are being crushed. So the Center for Economic and Social Rights have been working with partners to create an alternative model of indicators that can, through evidence-based data, show a different story. So we've created a set of indicators that are called the Egypt Social Progress Indicators that measure alternative ways to look at progress in health, education, labor, urbanization, food, water, cultural lands, and economic policy as a predeterminant for all these rights. And it measures progress on a color scale from no progress to good progress. And I want to share with you now a few findings from those alternative indicators for socio and economic well-being, and how the IMF-led economic reforms in the regions have reflected on those indicators that our partners developed to speak to the reality of their constituencies. So, for example, we found through the indicators that those austerity policies and the corporate captures that they produce fuel inequality and disproportionately affected women. So the percentage of the poverty, people living on the poverty line, as I've said, have increased. And with the removal of universal social protection system, the estimate percentage of the poor covered by targeted social protection programs have decreased actually from the first year it has been implemented. That was only covering 49% of the 32 million people to 40%. We also see that that loan program, those austerity measures have pushed for a reform where millions of people that work in that public sector that was providing services are pushed to the private sector to like slash out millions of people that work for the public sector. What that means for women is that they have to now work in a private sector that is among the worst in lower middle income countries in terms of legal protection for women from discrimination in the workplace. So that means that private sector has less regulations for maternity leave, for protection from sexual harassment, from giving safe transportation, and protection for equal pay, where according to World Bank statistics, women in the private sector in Egypt make 40 to 60% less income compared to their male counterparts. That's also very problematic for women because the overall women participation in the labor force is about 20 to 23%. And that's also a problem because work is usually what gives women health insurance. So if we also look at how the IMF-backed economic policies have negatively affected the state duty to progressively mobilize resources towards fulfilling economic and social rights, we see that the tax revenue in Egypt is really, really poor. It's 13% of the GDP, which has been decreasing from years before. And the direct tax as a percentage of the total taxation is also only 43%. So that means 58% of the total tax revenue is indirect. So for example, instead of increasing capital gains tax that only makes about 0.5% of total revenues for Egypt, the IMF has pushed the government to adopt a 14% VAT tax. The army is also and has a big economic empire in Egypt, and that ranges from, I don't know, like producing, I don't know, pasta and having wedding halls to producing medical supplies, for example. And all the army economic empire is exempt from VAT, but somehow women menstrual health products are not. So we see a lot of corruption here and a lot of nepotism. Like my previous colleague said, they don't really walk the talk. But also another way that those policies have disproportionately affected women is that due to the devaluation of the currency, drug manufacturers have not been able to import generic contraceptive materials for women's sexual health products, and that caused a great shortage. And you can see that in Egypt and in Tunisia, where women who are a little bit more affluent can buy the imported drugs, and those who can't have their lives violated. So I'm going to share a few more examples about fiscal policy and people's rights from Egypt and Tunisia.
You have 2 minutes.
Okay. So for example, if we look at the public spending side, so debt servicing, for example, takes up about 46% of total expenditure in Egypt, and that's been increasing over the years from 30% in 2017. We also see how out-of-pocket expenditure on health makes 60% of total expenditure, and we also see how the population covered by health insurance is only about 50%. And some women, especially women in rural areas, are completely out of that scheme. So that's 50% of people who are in already a very limited scheme. If we look in Tunisia, for example, we see similar models. We see that the share of education in the public budget is decreasing from 26% to 17% over the past decade. We also see a decrease in the quality of public services. We see people opting for private schools from 8% to 37%. We also see an increase in VAT, and we see the Tunisian dinar losing 49% of its value, which meant that inflation in food has skyrocketed. And also we see another pattern where contraceptives and IUDs have been lacking, and it caused deprivations on the market. So if we look at what that means for the pandemic, the IMF has given Egypt and Tunisia and a number of North African countries RFIs and standby arrangements without revising any of what those loan agreements policies have caused since the Arab Spring. We see people taken out of the street. We saw right before the pandemic, similar to the Latin American protests across Egypt and Lebanon and Iraq. So we anticipate there is a national study, an official study that says 2021 can see an increase in poverty from 38 to 44%. So 44 million additional, so 44 million people living in poverty if we don't change those dynamics. So these are very, very alarming trends. And if we have time in discussion, we could talk about what alternatives there could be. And yeah, thank you for giving me that opportunity to share those thoughts.
No, thank you so much for this. It was very illustrative as well, not only on the one hand about how during austerity measures there is this retrenchment of the state, which the UN Human Rights Representative has said that then the impact is that women become shock absorbers, but also how in this void of the state there is this corporate capture that also have a negative impact on women. And I just wanted to point out as well the interesting fact that both of you in Ecuador, Tunisia, or the Arab region, as well as in many countries in Latin America, there are also these social movements on the back demanding social justice and questioning this type of measures. And it seems like there is this disconnect between what the people is doing, although they are very active, and what is happening really at the decision-making level. So thank you so much for this. And we look forward to the time for the discussion when we can hear more about what you have to say about this. And now I'm gonna give the floor to our next speaker, who's gonna be speaking on a broader level precisely about the impact of these public wage bills and public services regarding fiscal austerity, but also what are these connections between gender justice, fiscal justice, during this current pandemic, and what could be also very importantly the ways forward. So we're gonna hear from Nilanjana Mukhia from ActionAid India, and she's a feminist activist based in Delhi, India. Over the last 20 years, she has worked on gender-based violence, sexual and reproductive health and rights, women's labor rights and social reproduction and care, public policy advocacy and campaigning. She brings also a South feminist diagnosis of and alternatives to dominant macroeconomic policies and the global economic and financial architecture. And currently she's working at ActionAid International as the head of global engagement. We are super thrilled to hear you. Go ahead, I'm giving you the floor, Nilanjana.
Thank you so much, Amelia. Thank you to ERA AP for creating the space, and thank you, Bhumika and the Third World Network for the invite. And I'm really thrilled to hear from Andrea and Mainur, because I think, you know, what Mainur said about the cookie cutter approach, I'm just going to sort of, you know, it's exactly that. And I wonder why IMF staff get paid so much, because they pretty much have been applying the same policies across the world. So I'm going to, as Amelia said, that I'm going to, you know, I have a lot to say about the bigger question around IFIs. But I'm going to speak to a report that we did, ActionAid did, which was Who Cares for the Future? Financing of Gender Responsive Public Services. And this was written, just to say that this was written, researched and written before the COVID pandemic hit, but it remains even more relevant. It has become even more relevant now. So the Who Cares report, in the Who Cares report, we look at the impact of the new debt crisis, which was before the pandemic, as well as IMF loan conditionalities and coercive policy advice to countries in the global south. And the impact on public spending. The aim of this report was to make the case that macroeconomic conditions and fiscal policies have a direct impact on women's paid and unpaid labor, and by extension, the fulfillment of a whole range of women's human rights. So just some on the IMF loan conditionalities and policy advice, just some very quick background. In the late 1970s, IMF sort of, changed its mandate, or the mandate was changed as it began to assume a much more prominent role in shaping countries' sort of broader economic policies when it began to provide loans to deeply indebted countries. And with those loans came, what we know as the structural adjustment programs and the conditionalities, and the failure to adhere to these loans. And it is important to sort of remember this, that the failure to adhere to IMF conditionalities could and still can result in suspension or cancellation of loans and damage a country's reputation with investors and other creditors. So therefore, in restricting governments' access to capital. And those conditions have proven to have disastrous side effects for most countries in the global south, greatly constraining the ability of developing country governments to pay for public services, amongst other things. And although the IMF stopped using the term structural adjustment in the 90s, neither the power dynamic between the IMF, so that's why we call it a neo-colonial sort of system, neither the power dynamic between the IMF and southern governments nor the economic policies themselves have changed. So quickly, in this Who Cares report, we examined 56 countries, all low income and a cross section of middle income countries, analyzing what the IMF had to say regarding the wage bill targets, deficit targets, inflation targets, on gender issues, social spending, and labor issues. And we took an intentionally broad approach to IMF conditionality, treating all IMF advice, including formal loan conditions, equally, because they have an impact, whether they're part of the formal loan conditions or not. And we found that just as in the 1980s and the 1990s, the IMF continues to insist that governments overcome or avoid the debt crisis by adopting policies that constrict their economies through sharp limits on public spending, limiting fiscal deficits, and holding inflation down, usually to about 5%. I'll speak to, although we looked at fiscal deficit and inflation targets as well, I'll speak to the public wage bill containment conditionalities. So nowhere is the IMF's choice between public goods and economic orthodoxy or neoliberal orthodoxy clearer than it is on its strictures on public sector wage bills. The IMF's position on wage bills has serious consequences, as we've just heard, for the capacity of countries to invest more in public services, deliver basic rights, and achieve the SDGs. The largest group of people on the public sector wage bill are education and health workers, teachers, doctors, nurses, and any expansion of which is desperately needed, especially under the COVID conditions. Any expansion of public services, for example, to achieve universal basic education, extended early childcare or elder care will require more people rather than less, and on government payroll, so as part of the public sector. And in many countries, there's also an urgent need to improve to sort of hike salaries of public sector workers and conditions of working conditions of public sector workers. Now, limiting, cutting, or freezing public sector wage bills has two direct impacts. Of course, it reduces the capacity of the government to offer public services, because you can't have public services without having public sector workers. And it also raises unemployment rates. Both of these have a disproportionate impact on women, who generally fill in for absent services. So it's passed on to women, as Amelia had said, and who make up a substantial percentage of those workers subjected to layoffs, outsourcing, or reduction of benefits, because they make up a large majority of public sector workers. In our review of IMF country documents, we found that of the 23 low-income countries, only 5 of them, so 22%, were expected to see any increase in wage bills. 7, 30%, were expected to see wage bill cuts, with 11, 48% effectively frozen. For countries in need of expanded public services, which is obvious, the news that 80% will not be seeing any. So the IMF loan conditionalities basically is sort of recommending to 80% of these 23 LICs to not see any increase in their public sector wage bills. The IMF pressuring to contain wage bills should be recognized for what it is. A direct contradiction of the aspirations to achieve the SDGs and deliver on rights. Freezing or cutting public sector wage bills should be completely unacceptable for countries in the global south. And we know this, especially under COVID, who are countries with desperate shortages of teachers, doctors, nurses, and other frontline public sector workers. Now, so this was, most of our research for the Who Cares report was done in 2019, and we published this in April 2020. So as the COVID pandemic was hitting the world. And we have a new policy briefing, the pandemic and the public sector. I'll sort of link, add all of those links. And we found that even in the emergency loans, there is a sort of, and we know this, there is commitments that IMF has extracted and pledges from recipient countries that they will return to or adopt austerity as soon as the pandemic recedes. So there is no space for recovery at all. So for example, in sub-Saharan Africa, 25 of 30 countries that have received emergency loans promise a full reset, and 4 more promise a partial one. So it'll be back to austerity, which speaks to the topic of this session. So yeah, like I said, we've also looked at deficit and inflation targets, but I'll leave that be for now. I'll move on to the other piece, which is debt. And again, just a reminder, this is, before the pandemic hit. And the debt crisis has become even worse, as we know. In 2019, the Jubilee Debt Campaign found external debt payments by developing countries had grown 85% from 2010 and between 2010 and 2018, from 6.6% of government revenue to about 12.2% of government revenue. But it needs to be pointed out that 21 countries were spending over 20% of their government revenue on debt services, with Angola and Ghana both spending over 55%. We, in this report, together with Jubilee Debt Campaign, examined 60 low and middle income countries who spend more than 13% of their revenue on debt servicing. In the 30 countries with highest debt payments, so that's over 13% of government revenue, real public spending per person, taking account of inflation, fell by 6% between 2015 and 2018. In the 30 countries with debt payments, under 13% of government revenue, public spending per person grew by 14%. So this makes it really clear that higher debt spending, and this is something that Andrea has spoken to, as well as Mainur, with higher debt payments, the spending on public services drops. And with lower debt payments, it increases. And this in turn means a continuing and even deepening exploitation of women's unpaid care and domestic work to fill in the gaps. We also found that several countries, so Congo Brazzaville, the Gambia, Ghana, Kenya, Zambia, and Sierra Leone, are spending more on debt servicing than they are on health and education budgets combined. And many other countries spend the equivalent of over half of their total budget for health and education just on repaying debts.
You have 1 minute left.
Yes, okay. I'll just, finally, we estimated how much extra cash countries would have on hand to add to their overall budget for public spending and public services, including health, education, water, and other services, if their debt servicing was reduced to a threshold of 12%. So we're not even talking about debt cancellation. We found that, for example, Bangladesh and Ghana would each have over 5 billion to invest in public services every year, and Kenya would have over 4 billion a year in extra revenue. So just to say that this is the question of macroeconomic, fiscal, and monetary policies have an impact on women's, it not only disproportionately impacts women, all of this is being sustained by women's unpaid care and domestic work and women's precarious work, whether in the public sector, the informal sector, or even in the private sector. So it's a question of, the fiscal justice question is a question of justice, justice for women and justice for trans and non-binary people as well. So I'll stop there. Happy to talk more during the discussion. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Nilanjana. And by listening to you, I was reminded of that figure as well by Jubilee, that campaign, in saying that if only the IMF would give away the 7% of its gold reserve, that would be enough to pay for the cancellation of debt of around the poorest 70 countries in the world. And that would still leave them with a plus of their gold reserve of around 26 billion. So it is really impressive, all of the tragic figures that you're mentioning. And although these bodies seem to be helping in supporting those countries in the fight against poverty, we see that there is a colonial alliance as well. It's not only by those that we call developed countries, the powerful countries. These bodies are as well working against the development of our developed countries. And well, this may lead us to hearing more from our next panelists, who will provide the colonial lens precisely to development economics and the colonial legacy of austerity. I'm going to give the floor now to Priya Luka, who's a research fellow at Goldsmiths University. And she used also to be chief development economist at Christian Aid up to recently. Priya, very happy to have you here live, because we thought we would have you on a video, but it's way better to hear you and experience this overall combination of excellent panelists. Go ahead, Priya, you have the floor.
Thanks so much, and thanks for the welcome and the introduction. And it's been great to hear from the other panelists, and thanks to Third World Network and Bhumika for so much organization, and to you, Emilia, as well. So I wanted to talk about what, from my perspective, what I've been looking into in terms of fiscal injustice and the kind of journey that we need to have from a colonial past to kind of contemporary struggles for financial fiscal justice, and what part an anti-racist present plays in that as well. So I think, you know, for me, the politics of global poverty are wrapped up in the need for systems change and a racial inequity that's hardwired into our current setup. And that's got huge, huge gender implications, huge disproportionate impacts for women. But I think that all of the things that we work on in the space of fiscal justice, so debt, tax, the issue of climate change, can't really be worked on without much more far-reaching strategies for transformation. And that's why I've been looking at particularly the idea of reparations and the idea of what an anti-imperial approach to economic systems would look like and would mean in reality, and trying to build on kind of what the kind of powerful work of many reparations movements globally means for economic systems re-envisioning. So I think at this time, in this moment, in this post-COVID realization, we're seeing clearly all over the world that Black, Brown and other ethnic groups have higher rates of poor outcomes across health, social and economic dimensions. And there's now a lot of data to validate this as well. So we can see quite clearly that race is a driver of poverty. And I think that's built from my own consideration of racial and ethnic stratification in different contexts, but it's really important because it helps us build a global picture of disadvantage in the overall context of colonial histories, racialized economic policies and the ideologies of race. And this is where particularly my research is situated. So the starting place for me on tackling fiscal injustice is really turning to support reparational justice movements where there's a recognition of colonialism. And I think colonialism is really important to understand when we think about the IMF, the World Bank, the actual economic apparatus that governs all of the contexts that we're talking about in this panel. So what we know is colonialism has resulted in many forms of damage, economic, ecological, societal, political and psychological. And the concept of reparations and why it's so important for fiscal justice is that it's firmly based on this idea of the repair of this damage. So all of the individual contexts that we've been talking about, the over-indebtedness, the fact that the gold reserves could tackle the poverty, endemic poverty of the 70 of the most poorest countries. I think that these are these are the ideas of kind of re-envisioning. These are the ideas of kind of repair for damage. I think it's really important to kind of stress and kind of recognize that most reparations movements don't just call for monetary compensation. This is really important because they call for a more holistic form of justice, viewing the inequalities of the global economy as rooted in a kind of continuum of colonialism, where we kind of recognize that nobody's unequal alone. Extreme poverty sits alongside or is fueled by extreme wealth, and marginalization exists alongside power and burden. So we have to think about the kind of dichotomy of these issues together, and bringing about reparations rests in using the framework for it. So in 2003, we had the UN Guiding Principles, which I will just mention very briefly here because of time, but they are restitution, the restoration of the original situation before violation, compensation, not just in terms of monetary, but mental and physical harm, satisfaction, so a need for truthful public discourse and the acceptance of responsibilities, and guarantees of non-repetition, so to ensure that violations do not happen again. And I think that many commentators now agree that the forces formerly used to control the colonized persist in the structures today. So I think in many of the discussions that we've just seen in this session alone, what we're seeing is that these are not distant crimes of previous figures in history, but the genesis of our current global system, which ensure that the interests of economic growth are prioritized over the lives of those who are powerless, poorer, and invariably people of color as well. So this is why I feel that the racial justice aspect is really at the heart of the decolonization movement as well. And I think it's clear to see that many countries have gained political independence, but many of the economic power structures, processes and mechanisms that have enabled colonial exploitation have left this enduring effect of discrimination, inequality and poverty that we see today. So this is the continuation of the neo-colonial project. So I just wanted to mention before, because I know that we're probably going to say I'm running out of time soon as well. So I will quickly go through just a few things in terms of the movement and what it represents. So I think that what I want to say is that the reparations movement is vibrant. There's many different aspects to it all across the world, globally, in different contexts. And there's very many institutions that are already there within the movement that support knowledge generation and support sharing across different contexts. And, you know, particularly like looking at kind of, you know, where the movement has derived its kind of understanding of reparations from an African context. How does that apply in other global South contexts, like for Asia as well? So just to mention, there's the Pan-African Reparations Coalition in Europe, PARCO. This is a grassroots alliance of organizations and movements amplifying the cause for reparations in Europe. And it uses the idea of holistic repair as its basis. There's other organizations like CARICOM that have a 10-point plan for reparatory justice in the Caribbean. There's the International Network of Scholars and Activists for African Reparations, which was created in 2017 and is a project coordinated by the Universities of Edinburgh and Boston. And I think that this connects not just in terms of kind of, you know, a kind of discussion of the issue of reparations. Reparations for me also means what's the ethos of how you can apply a reparations lens to the issue of climate change, to the issue of land redistribution, to the very issue of the existence of the institutions like the IMF and the World Bank, and what would be a reparations approach to kind of re-envisioning how they work and how they're structured. So that's where a lot of my work and a lot of the things that I've been trying to think about have been sort of focused. I would say that, you know, I think that there is this idea that, you know, where is the influence, like, you know, trying to identify where the influence of the IFIs is. And it's clear that it is, you know, there are many kind of indirect forms of influence rather than immediate control over government policy that previous colonial administrations had. But that's not to say that the kind of political influence isn't there as well. And I think it's Reverend Jesse Jackson who said that the continued imperialism of the wealthy countries continues, but they no longer use bullets and ropes. They use the World Bank and the IMF. So I think for me, it's about kind of really understanding where we can push for change, where we can create like a synergy between different movements and what they're calling for, and where we can kind of provide practical envisioning ideas for what would be the global infrastructure if it was kind of based on much more harmonizing principles of holistic repair that underpins the reparations movement. And I think that it's really important to kind of think about kind of the current global structure is colonial in origin, so repairing it means more than just tinkering at the edges. So it really needs us to kind of connect these dots in our collective history, dots that link how policy is made at a global level, and then reframe the debate through bringing a powerful historical analysis into that modern day context. And I think that's where we'll get the ideas for a kind of complete policy revolution. So recognizing, first of all, that the current structural framework as governed by the leading institutions is increasing inequality, and then what does a kind of re-envisioning or creating alternative governance and regulatory spaces that challenge the status quo mean? Or do we work in those spaces and create a strong oppositional critique, including exploring ways of shifting decision-making to really reflect local legitimacy? So I'll end there. I think that that's given a bit of a flavour of some of the research that I've been doing, but happy to kind of talk more during the questions and the wider discussion.
Priya, thank you so much for this fascinating intervention, because you're also reminding us about the relevance of centering the people who has been suffering the harm, and really address that by putting them at the center, then all the solutions need to unfold from that. So it's not the other way around, and sometimes our solutions sound very abstract, but I think this is making a very tight connections between radical solutions, new creative ways of thinking, and at the same time being realistic about not talking about processes in the past, but also linking them to what is happening now, and how to put the solutions that are working at the immediate moment for the people. So thank you so much. I think we have a lot to talk about now, and I'm just gonna give the floor now to my very much admired and dear Bhumika, because she's gonna be answering the question that we started with this panel. That is, why is it that despite all of the warnings that all of these social movements have highlighted for decades about the damage of austerity measures on the ground for developing countries, these international financial institutions keep on insisting on those? So what Bhumika will focus on, and we know that she's working with the Third World Network, she will focus on this neoliberal ideology of austerity and how even this ideology can even override the real effects that we see on the ground, but also what is the way in which the structural dependency of the global south on borrowing from international capital markets is the element that is driving the austerity bias. So Bhumika is an advocate, an activist, and scholar on the international financial architecture, feminist economist, and decolonial theory. And the Third World Network has been her home since 2009. We all admire very much the Third World Network. And she comes from Indonesia and India, and based in New York, and has 20 years of experience in global justice organizations, starting with the Seattle and Washington protests against the international financial institutions in the alter globalization movement. Bhumika, you have the floor.
Thank you, Amelia. I hope you can hear me. Thank you to all the amazing panelists. I am just so thrilled to get such a firepower team of feminist economists and activists and advocates. Amazing. So I'm going to focus on 5 structural challenges in austerity theory, methodology, and politics. And then I'm going to wrap up with 7 ways to decolonize austerity, sort of a run through. I'm going to start with the neoclassical economic methodology and then talk about neoliberal ideology, and invoke other knowledge systems of economics, other economic theories, structural, feminist, developmental, ecological, and Marxist, the colonial governance of the IMF and World Bank, which remains unchanged from its inception, establishment 1944, and the various other international forms of fiscal drain that are obscured in austerity prescriptions in the IMF and by international creditors. So I just want to take a broad look at what is the key rationale for austerity across all the international financial institutions, not just the IMF. The IMF prescribes it in loans, but this is embedded within the World Bank and the regional development banks. So we focus on the IMF only because that is where it is enforced, but otherwise fiscal austerity is rationalized across all institutions. The key rationale is in one line, straight from the IMF's recent fiscal outlook produced in April 2020. Fiscal credibility is essential to restore investor confidence and attract foreign investment. It has been essentially unchanged for the last several decades, going back to even before the Asian financial crisis. Now, this fiscal credibility is achieved by 2 methods, reducing debt and reducing public expenditure to so-called sustainable levels. The central contradiction here is that austerity has been demonstrated time and again through mountains of evidence throughout history, not just the last 40 years of neoliberalism, but throughout centuries, to actually increase debt when the underlying domestic economy shrinks. And the underlying domestic economy shrinks when investment in public systems, services, and goods is is reduced. So from the IMF's own research team to academia and civil society, we see that poverty and inequality increases, recessions deepen. So this prioritization of macro stability through the primary channel of debt and expenditure is essentially for what purpose? It's essentially a signal. It's a signal to markets and lenders that debt and deficits will not obstruct debt repayments and private sector interests to avoid risks and losses. This bias toward fiscal austerity, sometimes deemed fiscal fundamentalism by heterodox economists, runs very deep. So deep that even in the greatest crisis of a century, in this pandemic, it is still being enforced as early as 2021. An underlying dilemma is that austerity politics is perpetuated by a narrow and linear perspective of seeing public financing for public services as a short-term expenditure rather than as a long-term investment that gives back multiple times through the ability of societies to access the economic and social rights to social protection, employment, health, education, and support for care and informal economies. A key problem here is the way that debt sustainability is assessed. We know that debt sustainability is based on primarily the ability to repay external debt to creditors. This ability to repay does not consider financing for gender equality, for climate change, for sustainable development goals, or for human welfare. I want to turn now to then what is the underlying sort of ideology and principles, or let's say the elements that organize the apparatus of neoliberalism. If we look at neoliberalism like a sort of constellation, like a sort of arrangement, then we see that actually there is a social contract that has been very interestingly shaped. So we know that since the late 1970s, Reagan-Thatcher era, the neoliberal economic model has centered a free market policy agenda. We all know the mantras of liberalization, austerity, deregulation, privatization. But an interesting point is that decades before that point, starting at the interwar period between World War I and World War II, around the 1920s and 30s, the role of the state was strategically shaped by a small group of elite Western economists in Europe. This group of economists, known as the Vienna Circle, advanced certain specific ideas on using or deploying the state to serve and facilitate the market. And in fact, these theories go all the way back to David Hume and John Locke in the treatise on the government, these older texts. A few decades later, in the 1940s, international financial institutions such as the IMF and World Bank were established as vehicles through which to universalize market-oriented rules, policy norms, and legal protections. So we see that some of the key elements that shape this ideology are reducing the space for alternative institutions, disorganizing alternate centers of state and worker and people power, deregulating the ability of states to govern the market, financialization based on speculation, short-termism, competition, and especially free capital mobility. We see also this element of ideological sprawl in that the free market ideas are absorbed and normalized by educational institutions, governments, businesses, as well as social norms in society. Where does austerity policies come in? They serve these elements by systematically weakening state capacity to invest in public systems and redistribute wealth to the poor, while protecting creditors, firms, and the free flow of capital. So I want to turn to what is often called the knowledge power complex, in that one of the key underlying issues around fiscal fundamentalism is that the dominant neoclassical economic discipline is just one out of many possible economic theories and ideas. There's a much wider spectrum. So we must ask who is producing which knowledge and what are the vested interests of these actors, whose knowledge systems, theories, and methodologies are taught in school and university curriculums. We know that most economic departments teach primarily neoclassical economics, known as the Chicago School of Economics. So this knowledge power complex, where power creates knowledge, is a colonial legacy involving centuries of intellectual erasure of non-Western knowledge systems under the colonial narratives of civilizing others through modernity, science, and rationality. There are at least 9 major schools of economics and various multiple smaller schools: feminist, ecological, Marxist, Keynesian, developmentalist, Latin American, structuralist. Where neoclassical economic theory says societies are made up of rational and selfish individuals, risk is calculable and must be averted. Choices, exchange, and consumption are the most important domains of economic activity, and the free market will automatically correct inefficiencies. What do structural feminist and development economics say? They say that societies are composed of gender unequal class structures. They say the world is complex and uncertain and risk is not calculable. They say the most important domain of economies is production and human welfare, including care and informal economies. And they say that the state must use active fiscal policy to redistribute income, create jobs, diversify economies, and protect local and small businesses. Now, IFI colonial governance. We know that since 1944, governance has remained relatively unchanged. The problem starts at the top. We know the leaders of the World Bank and IMF are not elected, but are appointed by the US and Europe, a World Bank by the US, IMF by Europe. The actual voting power of these institutions is so heavily skewed in favor of the rich countries. The US has veto power in the IMF, and together with the G7 and the EU, the OECD countries control over half of the voting power in both the IMF and World Bank. Middle and low income nations, which together constitute 85% of the world's population, have a minority share. If we look at these voting allocations in per capita terms, the inequalities reveal that for every vote that the average person in the global north has, the average person in the global south has only 1/8 of a vote. This inequality is, of course, racialized, as Priya pointed out, and is in many ways, as the author Jason Hickel says, a form of apartheid operating right at the heart of international economic governance today, and has very well come to be accepted as normal. So in this way, inequality begets inequality. Now, there's fiscal drains of all levels of international scope. There's tax evasion, there's trade liberalization where tariffs are eliminated, there's key source of government revenue, there's intellectual property rights, royalties, there's interest rate inequalities. But just to point out tax evasion, as we all know, tax justice is so central. In 2015, the high-level panel on tax evasion in Africa underscored that the African continent loses more than 50 billion of domestic revenue on an annual basis. In 2013, there was 27 trillion in 5 tax havens around the world. So what about salvaging these rightful public funds rather than draining public coffers? The IMF does not answer this. I'm going to give you 7 steps that I'm going to just outline 2 words: decolonizing fiscal austerity. The fiscal justice must be centered on a feminist and anti-racist fiscal policy toolkit that scales up public services supporting women and children, creates universal social protection floors and social security, taxes big business, creates work. This entails eliminating or at least minimizing GDP as a central construct of development economics and centering human development indicators that prioritize public systems and services. It also entails human rights impact assessments with data disaggregated by gender and social groups. 2, it entails a sovereign debt restructuring mechanism and revamping the debt sustainability assessment so that it considers human rights, gender inequality, and climate change. 3, decolonizing the IMF and World Bank governance through double majority voting. What is double majority voting? It means that voting requires not just shareholder majorities in terms of how much money is contributed to the institutions, but also requires member state majorities that center population so that global South countries have a fair share in the decisions that affect them. Number 4, pluralizing economic models and theories to feminist, structural, and Keynesian in particular. These 3 economic models and theories uphold a social contract where institutions serve society, not the market. Number 6, tax justice, a universal and intergovernmental tax body at the UN. And number 7, as my dear colleague Soren Ambrose put it, who has recently passed, he said, perhaps it is time to find a way for global agencies other than the IMF, such as the UN Conference on Trade and Development or the UN Development Program, whose mandate goes beyond maintaining a particular definition of economic rigor to valuing development and global welfare, to take a more active, even a leading role in devising financial recovery plans for developing countries. I just want to conclude by saying that all of this underlines a recognition of history, the great transfers of wealth, extraction of natural resources, use of cheap or free labor from the colonies to the metropoles is not just a historical travesty. This wealth transfer over centuries diffused capital and resources across Europe, North America, and other settler colonies such as Australia and South Africa. And it creates the very conditions for industrialization and economic wealth, where today it is incumbent that the principles of historical responsibility and interdependency guides the actors of economic power to support health and economic recovery for the global South, because the counterfactual is a lost decade for the vast majority of the human race. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bhumika. And now the audience can take pity on me, because I will have to also moderate a conversation and limit what our speakers can want to say, whilst this has been a very fascinating conversation, and I will have to try to give the room for all of the topics, whilst we could really spend another 5 days talking about each of these issues. So I'm gonna go to the chat. If you have any questions or comments, please share those with us. So I'm gonna try to tie 3 of them and bring it back to each one of you. So just in general terms, we have a comment in mentioning about what a shame it is that Ecuador has been suffering these situations and they keep on coming back. What about that recurrence, and as if we were not learning from history, right? And also there is this invitation for joint work with specifically at the Arab states feminists who are very much rising for all of these issues that we've been mentioning in terms of economic justice, environmental justice, etc. And there is a specific question for Nilanjana about the impact of debt on non-binary persons. And I'm gonna read them all as I have them until this final one about what is planned by the CSOs in terms of IMF advocacy on these issues about the COVID loans that will end up in 2021 can unfold more devastation. So let me see. Yes, and there is a specific question for Bhumika in repeating the 5 and 6 elements that she was mentioning. So I'm gonna open the floor perhaps for Andrea first, and I'm just receiving one question for Andrea. Have the IMF made any moves to consult civil society in Ecuador? And I also need to say how everybody in this panel is also joining Bhumika in the remembrance of Soren's, especially in these issues about not only tackling the major challenges of humanity, but also in the relevance of mobilizing. So Andrea, I'm gonna give you 3 minutes.
Thank you, Emilia. And I want just to make a quick reflection that all the panelists have made an incredible intersection, not only on the economic consequences of this unequal system, this financial system, and that has also consequences on the participation of very few groups of people that only represent a few interests, and the way that Nilanjana and Priya make this reflection on the way that reparation has to take place in this moment. And I want to also connect with the question is that the IMF has shifted through the history, because it's obviously that the history now and the politics now, it's not the same as if we're in the 80s. And so the forces, the political forces in the geopolitics has changed, and also has changed a demonstration of governments, at least I can say it in the region, in the Latin American region, that has openly confronted the IMF and its consequences. So I think that this new rhetoric of the IMF it's basically that they are challenging this new moment with this rhetoric, but in their acts we see that there is few space on autocritic. And about the question, we see now we have in Ecuador, in Quito, an office of the IMF, and all, and they haven't reached as spaces, or haven't opened spaces for a dialogue with civil society. They have dialogues, but off the records with groups, with representative groups, and they um, they are lacking of these conversations. But I think that it is not only because the IMF, um, it is really comfortable just speaking with the government, but we see, for example, in Argentina, where government made the IMF sit with huge unions, with huge leader unions. So I think there is a responsibility that is shared of this lack of consultation and evaluation. So it's time, right now. It's very difficult time because it's election time. So people are not very paying attention to the reforms of the IMF. But it is crucial to shine a light on these reforms that they are asking, because these reforms will determine the ways and the instruments and the fiscal instruments that the next government or had will can use for how we said, putting people's life first and livelihood. So no, they haven't reached any space of consultation. So they haven't opened these spaces.
Thank you so much, Andrea. And Mahinor, I don't know if you want to also address the issue of movements, but also engage in a dialogue with any reflections that you still have about what you've heard from the other panelists, or anything else that you would like to mention now.
Sure, absolutely. Thank you so much, and thank you so much for the panelists. That was really inspiring. And on engaging with movements, I think it's really crucial, and I think it's really important. And I think that we're only powerful where we put the movements behind the policies and the suggestions and the forums and the academic thoughts that help us analyze the root causes of the deprivations that we're at, or that we're facing across the globe. And it's really stunning to see those patterns across regions. So thank you again for giving us the opportunity to convene in that way, and always looking forward to bridging those silos. I especially I appreciated all the interventions, but also especially the interventions by Bhumika and Priya, in helping us look at the historic root causes for the system as it stands today. And I think it's crucial that in our advocacy, in our mobilization with movements, in economic governance spaces, in development spaces, in human rights spaces, that we go back to those moments, that we don't allow those systems to tell us like, oh, colonial analysis is so passé, this is like ideological, or this is political. I think there is strong ground for connection of all those dialogues, and I think that connecting these dots is really what can help us make a shift, especially as we see before our eyes the repercussions of these decades of policies unfold in a situation as dangerous and as unfortunate as the pandemic. So thank you again, and really looking forward to continuing conversations.
Thank you so much. And yes, even the notions of global south and global north, they say, oh, that's so old. We have moved on to a new international paradigm. And it's like, no, what are you talking about? You know, and these macro agendas are the ones that are opening the eyes to what is really happening. And even notions like colonial imposition and even imperialism is very well, all of these notions are very well alive and kicking, and we see the effects of those every day. Thank you for that. And well, Neil and Jana also shared with us a link about this report she was talking about the Who Cares, and she also has a specific question on the impact of non-binary persons, but also feel free to address any other issue you would like to have. Thank you.
Yeah, on the question of sort of what do we do? I think, I mean, now I'm taking my ActionAid hat off and being a little more militant. I don't think there's any reason to hope for any reform. It's been 75 years, and I think it's a question of 75 years being enough. And so what do we do? I think that this is not just a question of what movements are saying and what protests are happening. This is also a question about sovereignty. So that's why it's a neocolonial, it is neocolonial because it's a question of sovereignty, and it is deliberate that the same cookie cutter sort of policies are being imposed across the global South. So yes, we should be absolutely clear about what the structure is. We should definitely not just look at are pressuring our governments to reject IMF austerity policies. And Bhumika is right, it's not just the IMF, even though we are focusing on the IMF. And it's a question of, it's a feminist sort of question because it relates not only to the disproportionate impacts on women, but it also, and trans and non-binary people, but it also relates to the question of women being taking on the burden and taking on the work that, taking on the obligations that the state has sort of abdicated on. So and that's what keeps neoliberalism afloat, because women are the safety net, the low-cost safety net. On the trans and non-binary question, I think it requires a lot of time, but I think we need to look at how the sort of colonial imposition of what a family is, a male-headed, family, nuclear family, and what women and heteronormative gendered roles, not only what impact that has on women, but also what impact that has on trans and non-binary people who are criminalized in lots of countries because of, colonial sort of, imposition of that criminalization of, and creating a social, I think that there is a lot to discuss. I don't think we have a lot of time here, but it relates to capitalism, and it relates to how capitalism externalizes costs of reproducing labor and sort of depending on women's unpaid domestic work within this sort of male-headed family model, and what that means for not just women but trans and non-binary people. So I know that I didn't really answer that question, but I think that we need to examine it as feminists and look at sort of women's rights and LGBTQ questions from a question of resisting capitalism and neoliberal capitalism specifically. So yeah, inadequate answer, but yeah, requires a longer conversation, dedicated conversation. Thanks, I'll end there.
Thank you so much. I think this is fascinating. I'm gonna refrain myself from editorializing because we want to hear from all of you fascinating panelists, but I agree with you. We need to keep on talking about all of these issues. In the end, this is also about the link between what is happening on the ground and what has been imposed on a system. And I just really wanted to emphasize what Jokling has been saying about this is what we're talking about is about this hyper-colonialism, not colonialism, hyper. I think this is a great definition about with the financial institutions at the driver's seat. And she's also posing a question about how the IMF is facilitating all of these private sector financial instruments and how we can put them more at the center. Right. So Priya, also, you left us very impressed with all of these very fascinating linkages you were making about reparations in the context of these austerity measures and the impact of these interrelated challenges. So I don't know if you want to go back again in terms of what you were advancing in terms of solutions, but also to address any other issue that you would like to share with us.
I mean, it's just been a beautiful discussion space. And I think that the fact that we can be in this kind of context and share different ideas about how our different visions for what we see as kind of policy ideas for the future, and then how that can manifest in different movements coming together is really, really important. But I think, you know, for me, like having worked in the international development context, I think now more than ever, I've come from that experience really thinking that building a historical understanding into today's context of power analysis is really important. And I think that, you know, like Frantz Fanon has written about the colonial process is not solely about dominating the present and the future, because it's also distorted and it's disfigured the past of oppressed people. And that kind of concealment of history, knowledge and tradition means that the kind of so-called West, you know, if we're going to have these delineations, the West knowledge has become predominant. And I think that actually international development continues this process of historical amnesia. Whilst structural causes of poverty and inequality are correctly identified, the history and the responsibility of governing structures is rarely addressed. And I really loved the way that Bhumika broke down the kind of several aspects to that. But I think, you know, particularly for me, the role of Indigenous knowledge and the evolution of Indigenous approaches in responding to changing contexts is often ignored. So, you know, this idea that development narratives start from today as year zero, and the vast global inequalities and injustices we see around us are just not put into any historical context. I think that kind of allows this kind of, you know, powerful figures to talk about the potential of a bright future without actually addressing the inherited privilege or the responsibility to make amends for the actions of the past. So that's kind of my kind of evolving ideas on how I have used, you know, the richness of the reparations tradition, which I'm still very much a kind of learning student in, to apply it to the economic framework and think about what would be a reparations ethos to re-envisioning all of this.
Thank you so much for this. No, definitely. And I think also everybody in this panel, what has done is have an amazing effort on connecting several dots that usually are scattered and siloed, and everybody has been mentioning all of the problems and how they're interconnected with different set of actors that are interacting, let us say, as well, by means of a dynamic that is benefiting others that seem to be on the ground, right? So these ways in bringing the actors back again, and also recognizing the historical determination that led us here is a very good starting point. And I want to also give the floor to Bhumika in this paradox of the so-called democratic countries in reality imposing a very undemocratic dynamic in the IFIs, but also any other thing that you would like to address, Bhumika. Go ahead.
Yeah, I just really love the question that forgive me if I pronounce your name wrong, but Humay, posed on the question is, based on the voter power inequality identified, doesn't the Global South raise the issue of the undemocratic nature of the global fiscal financial system, which is dominated by quote unquote democratic states? This is the sort of central contradiction, but also the central sort of configuration of the international financial system, where there is a perforation between political systems and financial systems. If we look at the normalization or the concepts of democracy is with regard to the political system, the political representation, methods of voting, electing, campaigning. However, when we look at the financial apparatus of banks, of investors, of financial markets, of the financial transactions, the securities, the shadow banks, there isn't much of a shred of democracy within these financial transactions and systems. I mean, shadow banks is an actual legitimate term in the international financial architecture. The calls for transparency have always been at the heart of advocacy reforms. And I think the key heart of this is that there has been a very systematic and very collective, very, very organized effort at legalizing these transactions, at legalizing these systems. We look at tax evasion. This isn't just a phenomenon. There's a vast architecture for legalizing tax evasion. And there are professionals that have positions in the investment banks, at UBS, at Royal Bank of Scotland, whose sole purpose is to configure this tax evasion architecture and to make it accessible to global investors and bankers. And this is just one example, but we know that in all the financial firms and investment funds and intermediaries, there are vast systems of legalizing securities trading, derivatives trading, which is essentially a legalized casino. It's, I mean, the 2008 global financial crisis was about, junk bonds, junk mortgage bonds, and all kinds of unfathomably complex collateral debt obligations, these CDO instruments. I mean, on the individual scale of society, such things would be pure like illegal gambling, right? So we see one of the issues with the international financial architecture is the ways in which completely undemocratic, illicit activity is legalized. I mean, even the biggest banks, including UBS and Citibank and Chase, have been found very much at the heart of financing drug trafficking, financing all kinds of illegal money laundering activities. So I think this is a key issue that we need to also call out. We need to call out in ways that which the ideas of democracy do not, this is again the way in which the power of ideas circulate, that there is a powerful idea of democracy being that of political democracy, but not necessarily financial and structural democracy. So thank you for that question.
Thank you. And, I'm definitely convinced that there is a very strong linkage between white supremacy and fascism, which is the other side of colonialism that is related to what Priya was saying. But I'm definitely convinced, and these are the linkages that also we need to be doing more and more. I see a comment by Nilanjana in the chat about the collusion of fascism and neoliberalism. But we're a bit over the time, but actually we have requested a bit of allowances of time, and so we would have like 7 more minutes. And I don't know, for those of you who know me, how much acquainted you are with my love for chaos. So I'm gonna bring that in practice. As a moderator, I have that faculty. So I'm gonna invite all of our panelists to open their mics, open their videos. Hopefully we won't crash the technical platform. But what I would like is to have you all on screen to hear if we can have some sort of a dialogue rather than just being isolated amongst ourselves. If we can try, I mean, to me, chaos has a very beautiful dynamic as well, and we are always respectful of our times. So perhaps if all of our panelists can engage in a final conversation for this past 6 minutes, I'm sorry. Okay, Andrea is having trouble with her internet. Hopefully she can jump in, and we're still missing Pri as well. Oh, there she is. So hopefully we can also bring Andrea, and if not, perhaps Andrea can also type in her comments. So I'm gonna open the floor and let chaos brings its beauty here in this dance of these amazing women.
Love that, Amelia. The love for chaos.
This was amazing. Thank you very much. Yeah, very inspiring, very thought-provoking. Thank you for all the organizers. This is the last thing that I do before I sign off for the year. I'm in Brooklyn, so it's 10:40, and I cannot be happier for this to be the last thing to be doing in 2020. So thank you for that.
And inviting you to those events.
Yeah, Emilia, you want chaos, but we are all being very cagey. I don't know, because maybe the folks in the US are a little tired, maybe. So I'll jump in. Yeah, thanks so much. It was absolutely brilliant. Thank you, Bhumika, for the invitation, and of course, Euro AP. I've been trying to attend whichever sessions I could. So fantastic space. We had, just to say that we had organized as volunteers a South Feminist Futures Festival last week. And it was fantastic. And to move from that to this has been great. I think we need to continue to have a space as Southern feminists. We of course do engage, with our sisters in the North. But as feminists, we knew the South feminists, we need to engage, we need to talk to each other. We need to look at, colonialism, reparations, neocolonial. I love hypercolonialism, not even, I was saying recolonization, but I love the hypercolonialism framing. We need to keep talking about this and keep talking to each other. So thank you. I'm thrilled as well. Today is my last day as well. So before I sign off, so fantastic way to end the year.
Thank you, Neil and Donna. I really appreciate it. Thank you for all the panelists for making it possible to do this event. I approached most of you quite late, and that was because of my doing many different things and the planning for this. And it occurred to me that actually, having worked on the IMF for many years, really since all the way back in 2005, I'm at a point where I am trying to not be too cynical and hopeless. I'm trying to figure out, what makes sense, what actually needs to be said, what makes sense, and that we cannot remain at impact analysis. We know the impacts, we know the devastation wrought, we know the historical evidence. We need to go into the actual bullseye of the political questions, of the uncomfortable, of the disruptive, of the unsettling political questions that really pierce at the heart of injustice. So thank you for all the panelists and all the audience for really facilitating that dialogue. And I'm really hoping that we can further in civil society a really critical and effective discourse and strategy on decolonizing by recognizing, first of all, that we are not in a post-colonial state. We are very much in a much more sophisticated avatar and form and manifestation of colonialism. It's far more effective today. The divergence between the North and the South has quadrupled since the political independence of many South countries. And that only points to the fact that that independence was only political, certainly not structural or economic. And what concerns me the most is the ways in which our South countries have internalized and normalized, the politics of austerity and of neoliberalism. In effect, that they have drank the Kool-Aid. But we need to go beyond just immiserating about that and really look at what are the strategies around breaking this hegemony. What are the strategies around, really disrupting the internalization by the global South? Because it's no longer a very clear-cut North-South dialogue when many of our South governments are, complying with these economic models on their own accord, right? So we need to look at the deeper questions of why are they complying on their own accord, even when it's not imposed? Why are they still following through? Why are they still not diversifying and doing other things on the whole? And so I think the political structures are more important now than ever. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. I mean, I don't know if our Zoom is gonna turn off, but keep on betting on chaos. So final words from any of our panelists, and Priyanti is also joining the chaos and inviting us to the real party of the closure of this forum. So we should definitely join in. So anybody wants to jump in? Andrea or Mahinur, or we close it? We had enough of chaos.
I think it's wonderful.
Well, I want to say thank you to all of the fellow panelists. Here in Ecuador is 10:45 as well. So yeah, so I really appreciate this sharing of knowledge and experience, and this is the power of feminist movement. I think that is the capacity of finding links to unite the fight. So thank you so much to Bhumika, and this was a wonderful chat.
Thank you so much. And now I am going to go back to my role of moderator and my painful task of closing this session. This was fantastic, very inspiring, and hearing you all making all of these very creative links makes me also feel very inspired for what is to come in next year. So thank you so much. And thank you, the Third World Network, for organizing this. Thank you so much for the team at ERAO and the organizing team of this amazing Global South Women's Forum. We look forward to being again together in solidarity with our feminist movement next year. But for the time being, we're closing now, thanking our audience and also inviting everybody to the party. So thank you. Sending your kisses. Ciao.
Amelia, you were fantastic. Thank you.
Thank you, Amelia.
Yes, Amelia, thank you.